So, this is the fourth shir on just the tefillos of Shabbos. This is really a halacha review. Halacha is very important, of course. But I figured if we're going to discuss halacha, we might as well start at the very beginning, which every week I repeat what we've done already. This is our 10th shir, Baruch Hashem. More people watch the shir after it's given than watch it when we give it. When we give it, it's a respectable number. So we talked about muktzah, we talked about Shabbos guy, and we talked about candle lighting. And the next step is to talk about kiddush and the breads we use and the halachas of the meals and havdalah. Shalashudas is a big one. Why is there no kiddush for shalashudas? Haven't you ever wondered? So many other questions. And there's a lot of halachas there, but I figured if I'm going to, and then we'll go into the malachos, the 39 acts of creative labor review. But in order to do that, let's be shalem, let's be complete, and let's also go through the davening. So, as I said last week, this is not a siddur shir. So I want you to know, even though we're going to finish tonight for sure, I've said this for the fourth week in a row, we're going to finish tonight, but really we're going to finish tonight. My notes, this is all I have for notes tonight, just to be sure that I can't go, I can't, there's no way I could stretch this out beyond the time. So we are going to finish tonight Mariv, and then next week or the next shir is going to be Kiddush. I think next week we'll maybe dedicate to Purim Halacha. I haven't decided yet. So we are right now, the last two things we said last week were this anomaly of all three Shemona Esreis of Shabbos are different. We spoke about that week one. It's the only day of the year that's the case. And that's because Friday night we talk about Shabbos Bereshis, the creation Shabbos. Shabbos morning we talk about Yismach Moshe Matnas Chelko, the giving of the Torah Shabbos, the Felana Shabbos. And Mincha afternoon we talk about Avram Yogel, future tense, Yitzchak Yeranein, Yom Shekulo Shabbos, the days of Mashiach. But within the final bracha, Lokenu v'Lokei Avosenu, Ritzevim Nuchasenu, that blessing, Mekadesh HaShabbat, that's the same, except for one word. Friday night we say V'Yenuchu Va. Shabbos morning we say V'Yenuchu Vo, or Vai. And Shabbos afternoon by Mincha we say V'Yenuchu Vam. And we explained last week at the end the distinction between those three. And then we ended with Vayechulu, if you recall. So let's pick up there. So I want to read you a Gemara because, actually, before I even say that, and I may have mentioned this before, I can't remember, for the women watching, last week we talked a little bit about the women who are watching that don't typically come to shul Friday night, and they may not, or some may not be aware, especially younger ones, what goes on in shul Friday night, even if they've seen it, it was just a few times in their lifetime thus far. But I do want to mention something very interesting. There is a view. Now, I'm not telling you, what I'm telling you, I've never told my daughters. So I don't want you to think this is what I believe or this is what I accept as halacha. But there is a very significant view, not a radical view, that although Mariv was always up to people, it was never an obligation, it was a choice. And men took it upon themselves, just like women took on certain things. Men took on Mariv, so women don't have to daven Mariv. The Friday night Mariv, according to many, the Rav Yah and other Rishonim discuss this, it's actually obligatory. And if a woman wants to daven more, she's looking for something to do. Many times women are looking for something to take on. Men are also looking for something to take on. But if a woman's looking to taking on something, or let me say that differently, if there's a member of the Jewish community that wants to take on something, and that member happens to be a female, I would recommend Mariv Friday night, Kabbalas Shabbos and Mariv Friday night. During Corona, it's like when my wife goes away, a few times it's happened in my marriage that I was home alone for Shabbos, and I light the candles, and you read the Hiratzon, and it's very emotional when you see what your wife says every week. So during COVID, it's unbelievable that we're about to celebrate, commemorate, I don't know what the right word is, the first year anniversary. It's Corona's first birthday. I mean, this is the week before Purim that we started to talk about last year. Should there be a spiel? Should there not be a spiel? We decided to give a spiel. I got sick. And Valerie got sick and others got sick from that. I mean, no one knew any better, obviously. But for 4 months, I was home. And I never knew that my kids and my wife sang L'chadodi. They didn't daven the whole Marav, but they sang L'chadodi, and it's actually quite beautiful. In any event, so back to where we're holding, that's important to know because we'll see tonight that will come up again and again. But in any event, in the Mariv, we say V'echula Shmayim Va'aretz V'chotz V'akam. The same thing we say by Kiddush. And then, of course, we end with the typical Shabbos bracha, Lokeinu V'Elokei V'Seinu. When we finish Shmona Esrei, we say it again. So I think last week we pointed out that there's this strange minhag that people, if they miss it with the shul, they'll call someone over to say it with them. So I want to go into that in more detail. And in fact, I want to read to you the source. What is the source for saying Vayechulu Friday night? Now this also explains by Kiddush, because we actually say it 3 times. We say it in Shmona Esrei, we say it again as a community in shul, communally, and then we say it again by Kiddush. So I'm going to read you the Gemara. This is a Gemara in Shabbos and called Kisvei. The Gemara writes, Amar Rava, Vitim Rabbi Yeshua. Rava said, and some say the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Yeshua ben Levi, Afilu Yochid HaMispalel Be'erev Shabbos. Even if someone davens alone, they're not in a shul, Tzarech Lomer Vayechulu. You have to say Vayechulu, that chapter of verses in Bereshit. Why? Because Rav Hamnuna said anybody who davens Friday Eve and says Vayechulu ma'alav hakasuv kilu nasa shutuv lahakadosh baruch hu. God sees it as if you became a partner with him. So there's a lot of discussion. May the real Vayechulu stand up? Is it the one we say? What's the Gemara referring to? Is it the one we say in Kiddush? Is it the one we say as a Kehillah when we sing it? Is it the one we say during Shemona Esrei? So there are many different views. Most views hold. Last week I think we spoke about the other view, but most views actually hold the main one that said is the one we say after Shemona Esrei, and that's because there's a concept, a very important concept, and it's worthwhile coming tonight to know this halachic term. It's actually going to come up next week during Megillas Esther. And that's the concept of Berov Am Hadras Melech. With a multitude of people, do we give the king splendor? Have you ever wondered why it is, other than Pesach, one person typically makes Kiddush for everybody? Well, let's say Friday night. This is not a shir on Kiddush, but just as an example. Or one person makes Hamotzi for everybody. Why are we so careful with that? And the answer is that, counterintuitively, we could intuit, in fact, that the more people who do a mitzvah together, the greater honor it is for God. But counterintuitively, the way to do a mitzvah together by Kiddush is one person making Kiddush for everybody. Because now, let's say one person makes it for 100 people, that's the only way to have 100 people do Kiddush at once. That's why you have one person. In most families, the minhag is one person makes Kiddush for everybody to fulfill Berov Am Hadras Melech, that the greatest splendor to Hashem is if we do it together. So too Vayechulu. Yes, you said it during Shemona Esrei. That's very nice, very nice. But the fact is, isn't it a greater splendor to fulfill this Gemara in a Kehillah, in a Tzibor, in a congregation, in a communal setting? And that may be the main one. But, suffice it to say, we say both, so it doesn't really make a difference. And if you daven at home, you're only really saying, you may be saying 2, but you're saying them by yourself. What's interesting here is there are 2 languages. So we just read this language from the Gemara that if you say Vayechulu, you're a partner with God in creation. So the commentaries ask on this. There, for example, there's a sefer called the Kolbo. The Kolbo was written in the 13th century. It was written by an anonymous author. We don't know who the author of the Kolbo was, but he certainly was a Talmud Chacham. And he says, what type of language is this? I say Vayechulu and it's as if I'm a shutef. I don't mean to, don't get me wrong, because he asks, I'm quoting the Kolbo, this sounds very Christian. A partner with God? The halachic term for Christianity is shutfis, the belief that God has partners. They say the Father, the Son, they have all these concepts. That is avodah zarah, according to all opinions. It may be permissible for a non-Jew to believe, according to Ashkenazim, but it's certainly avodah zarah for us. So how could we make such a statement? It's a very difficult statement to make. And again, this is not esoteric. This is a Gemara. And this is why the art scroll and the Quran and the Mitzuda all have Vayechulu in it. So What does it mean that we're a partner with God? So there's a number of answers, but I'm just going to share with you tonight the Maharsha. The Maharsha says, I don't know if you've ever noticed this before, but some of the most beautiful praise to God, and also Kabbalistic, happens in the morning by Shachris, by the blessings of the Shema. Twice, not once, twice, in the beginning of the blessings of Shema, we say the following. He provides illumination for the earth and for those who dwell upon it with compassion. Uvetuvo, and in his goodness, mechadesh bechol yom tamid ma'aseh bereishis. He renews creation every day. We don't just say that here. One page later, or 2 pages later, by Shachris, by the bracha of Yotzer Hamaros, we say it again. Hamachadesh betuva b'chol yom tamid ma'aseh bereishis. That every day in his goodness, God renews the act of creation. If you've never noticed this before, it's a good reminder for me as well that we have to focus when we daven. It's not just that we say this once a week, we say this once a day. We say this twice every morning within 20 seconds of each other. I mean, the speed that some people daven within 6 seconds of each other, but we say it twice a day. So the Maharsha says the idea of a partnership in creation is every day when we wake up in the morning, there's new opportunities. We were depressed last night. We did Averos last night. We had depression last night. We had difficulties last night. We are a partner with Hashem in the sense that we have the ability to recreate the world, our world, every day, just like HaKadosh Baruch Hu recreates the world every day. And that's not the literal words of the Maharsha, but that's my reading of the Maharsha. And there's a very similar idea because the medieval commentators, and this is actually maybe more famous, they explain, you say Vayechulu, that we give testimony to God creating the world. And that's why, the Chafetz Chaim says, we mentioned last week, that you get someone else to say it with you if you fall behind the congregation. No one really follows that halachically, although some think we do. But what does that mean? I give testimony? I wasn't by creation. How could I give testimony? It's false testimony. It's one of the 10 commandments. I can't give testimony of God's creation. So some say, it's the idea that you believe in God to the point that it's as if you were there. That's very nice. I can't testify. Many attorney generals have gotten in trouble, and many prosecution staffs have gotten in trouble for the state or the city or local government because they knew so much that he was guilty, even though they didn't have evidence, that they forged evidence. This is false testimony. So how could you say this is a testimony? But again, we testify either in the sense that we believe it so fully, or because every day we recognize the newness of dawn, that with every dawn is a new day, and with every new day, we could create new opportunities. And just because we were in a fight with someone yesterday doesn't mean we have to be in a fight with someone today. This is one of the greatest lessons of life, not just about Shabbos. We're in cruise control in life, right? The people that we haven't been talking to for 10 years, we're going to continue to not talk to. The amount of time we waste a day, we'll continue to waste a day. Whatever we did yesterday, we'll do today. One of the great values of, let's say, Daf Yomi is that you learned yesterday the Daf, so you do today the Daf. We could break any cycle. And that's our testimony to Hashem. We know Hashem does this. We've seen it ourselves. Very interesting approach to this mitzvah. Okay, so let's move on now in the Siddur. So if you have a Siddur in front of you, so after Vayechulu, I'll tell you what page. I'm just going to use the art scroll every week. This is in the art scroll Siddur, page 346. So it starts at Vayechulu. And now we start Me'ein Sheva. Now Me'ein Sheva is just such a strange concept. So the word Me'ein just means abridged, and Sheva just means 7, the abridged of the 7. On Shabbos, there are only 7 blessings, the Shemona Esrei, because we don't say the full 18, 19. There are 7. So even though every Mariv, there's no Chazara, there's no repetition of Shemona Esrei, because, as we said, it started off not as obligatory. Strangely, Friday night there is one, and some actually bring this as a proof that Friday night Mariv is obligatory, and that's why women maybe should do it. but it's not a full repetition. It's a quasi repetition. So I want to show you something. Let's read this together. I'm going to share my screen. Let me make sure I know how to do this still. Every week I forget how to do this. Share. There we go. Okay. I see the Nissenfelds. Could you give me a thumbs up if you can see my Word file? Okay. So this is from the book. I sent this out to the shul last year. It's called Sefer Corona. It's about 130 pages, all about the coronavirus. And in it, I discussed, and we'll see why it relates to the coronavirus, Magen Avos. So let's read this together. So again, we're on page 346. Before we look inside, so it starts off, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu Elokei Avoseinu Elokei Avram Elokei Yitzchak Elokei Yaakov, Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Neirah, Kelyon, Koneh Shamayim V'Haaretz, Magen Avos, but it starts off with a typical repetition of Shemona Esrei. So where does this come from? We don't do this by any other matter. So let's read. Chazal inform us of a special bracha that is said by the Chazan after Shemona Esrei on Friday nights. The purpose of this bracha, let me actually make a new paragraph here. The purpose of this bracha was so as to delay the davening for latecomers. See, nothing is new. In 2,000 years, nothing's changed. Because their shuls would often be built far from the cities in fields. There was a fear of people leaving on their own, meaning that if someone came late, they would leave shul by themselves, and they were in the middle of a field. They didn't get zoning permission to build shuls in the middle of towns like we do today. And people would walk home by themselves, and it was dangerous. Okay, so that's reason number one. So this is a very technical reason. This explains why we had to do something. So we couldn't do a full repetition. We did this quasi-repetition, but we still use God's name. Pretty weird, but okay, we'll accept it for now. And this is all for latecomers. By the way, there's a lesson in this for everybody. A shul, everybody gets frustrated, those that stroll into davening at 10:30 in the morning, but there has to be a shul for them waiting too. We have to find, a shul, every shul is, their goal should be to l'karev, to bring people closer. You don't dismiss people. And we actually created a tefillah that makes a blessing, created a new blessing just so the latecomers are safe. And that's a great way philosophically to think about all members of the shul, those that come early and those that come late. Let's go on. The Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, gives an alternative reason for this blessing, this bracha. This is amazing. It was a replacement for Kiddush, for those who did not have wine. Fascinating. So, today you need wine. There's, what's his name? The Indian on the stories, he's an Indian expatriate. No, next to A to Z. It's called A to Z. It's called A to Z Liquors. The nicest guy in the world, and he knows more about kosher wine than anybody. But it wasn't always like that. Getting kosher wine was not always easy. And there were people that came to shul, they had no wine, they had no food. So we created, because as we'll see next week, what Kiddush is all about, this may be hard to understand for you now. Next week, when we get to what Kiddush really is, this will make a lot more sense. But this bracha is really for the people in shul who don't have wine. And this is their replacement Kiddush. Very interesting. So this is what I want. This is now, it's worth it to come tonight, especially for the men who say this every week, just to see this. So I said that this is called Me'ein Sheva. You don't have to read inside anymore. I'm keeping it open for a moment. You'll see why. Because it's a quasi of the seven. So what's an example of a quasi, another bracha that's called Me'ein? Where else in halacha do we have a bracha that's called Ma'ayin? Anybody know?
Al HaMichya.
Al HaMichya. Al HaMichya is Ma'ayin Sholosh. That's its real name. It's a quasi three. What are the three it's referring to? Birchat HaMazon. Birchat HaMazon, biblically, is until Uvnei Yerushalayim. It's the first three blessings. Al HaMichya is an encapsulation, an abridged version of those three blessings. That's the real name for Al HaMichya, Al HaEtz, Al HaGafed is Ma'ayin Shalosh. Just like this bracha is Ma'ayin Sheva. So where do we see that it's an encapsulation? How does it abridge Shemona Esrei? Now here, for the men, you're going to kick yourselves for never noticing this. You ready for this? Here we go. The first bracha, the first word is Magen Avos. What does that correspond to? The bracha of the Avos, obviously, right? The next one is Mechayim Eisim. What does that correspond to? The bracha of Mechayim Eisim Mishpan Esrei. Hakel HaKadosh she'ein kemohu. Hakel HaKadosh is the third blessing of Shemona Esrei. Literally, Hakel HaKadosh. The next one, Hamaniach Lama. What does that correspond to? The Berchas Mekadesh HaShabbos. The Yanuchuva. The same Shoresh, the same root. The fun of Navod, V'yirav Fachad. What is the fun of Navod? Before you, I do my service in the temple. That's the bracha of the Avoda, Ritzei. Ritzei should be italicized. This is great, just to fix my my notes here. The next one is V'noda Lishmo B'chol Yom Tamid. V'noda Lishmo. What does that mean? I give thanks to his name. Modim. It corresponds to Modim. And then Adon HaShalom. Mikadesh HaShavas Me'esherim V'nechlu Zeichel L'Maaseh V'Reishis. So Adon HaShalom is, of course, Sim Shalom or Shalom Rav. And there you go. That's the encapsulation of the entirety of Shemona Esrei. So, I mean, really, at least for the men who sing this every week, now you know why it's called Ma'ayin. It's an abridged version of Shemona Esrei, and now you can see it inside. The next time you sing this in shul or at home, it's going to mean so much more to you. In any event, so the $1 million question is for COVID and why this was in this book for COVID is, what do you do when you're davening not in a shul? So if you look in the Art Scroll Siddur on page 346, it states as follows. The following 3 paragraphs are omitted by an individual praying alone or by an occasional minyan, such as in the home of a mourner. So during COVID, this was a serious question many were asking. There were all these minyanim in people's backyard, on roofs, on balconies, and in dining rooms. Do we say this blessing, and why wouldn't we? So let's read a little bit more together. Based on the above reasoning for its decree, meaning for those in the fields, for shuls, the Shulchan Aruch writes that when davening alone, it is omitted. The Ramah says you could say it, just don't say the blessings. But what about when there is a minyan, rather they are not in shul or in a typical place, like we had to do during COVID? So a little later in the Shulchan Aruch, he writes, quote, we do not say this bracha when davening at the home of newlyweds or mourners, let's say by Sheva brachas, for the reason of latecomers / fields does not apply. So it would seem that during COVID, when we're davening in homes, even with a minyan, you wouldn't do it. The Mishnah Berurah, the Chafetz Chaim, explained that the above is due to a lack of kviyut, a stable minyan. If, however, they have a Sefer Torah and have been davening there for some time, then this bracha would be said. In fact, the Moshe Feinstein does not even require a Torah to be present, so long as this is a set and frequent Friday night minyan. So I'm going to stop the share. So what comes out from all of this is like this. Many communities have Friday night minyanim that meet every week or once a month. Those minyanim would continue to say that. That's a stable minyan. If the shul sends out that for the next few weeks we'll be davening in the Klein backyard, that's considered a stable minyan. We're talking about one-off minyanim. You don't say it. That's pretty much it. Now, we should mention that Sfardim disagree with this. The Ben Ish Chai, the great Rav of Baghdad, writes in the 1910s, he says, this is not the real reason, because there's a blessing here. It can't be this was for latecomers. It's one thing if you want to, sing a little bit, say a kapitel tehillim, but we invented a bracha. There must be something very mystical here. And because of that, in Yerushalayim, and many Sfardim outside Yerushalayim, they always say this bracha, no matter what. So you go to Sheva brachas, and all of a sudden they're davening in the hallway of the King David Hotel, and they start saying, Magen Avos. You go, no, shh, don't do that, because they probably are following Sephardi custom or Yerushalayim custom. But I want to share with you a couple of quick things about this. That these are imponderables. First of all, when you daven for the Amud, do you bow? So do you go? You can see me. You do Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu. Most Chazanim don't do that. You should. You really should. You really should be bowing here. The next thing is, these are just for the men, the Chazanim. You should really wait for the congregation to finish singing it, and then you should say it yourself. It's very important that it's said out loud. I'll also share with you, let me share my screen. I don't mean to scare you, but I want to read to everybody something. Let me open up my website. Here we go. The Mishnah Berurah says, the Shulchan Aruch writes, Ein ledaber, you're not allowed to talk. When the shul starts Vayechulu and Magin Avos, people think it's like a time to schmooze. Yeah, you're getting ready, you're tired, kiddush, you're hungry. It is one of the worst times in shul to talk. And the Mishnah Berurah says the name of the tour, so going back 600 years, B'Shem Sefer Chasidim, going back to now the 12th, 13th century. Ma'aseh b'chased echa, there was a story with a pious Jew that he made a deal with his friend. They should visit each other in the dream after they die. So that he had an appearance by his friend after his death. It says the Mishnah Berurah that just means in a dream. Upanav marokit, his face was yellow. Amarle, he said to him, Lama panacha marokit, why do you look green? Why do you look yellow? Amarle, he replied, because I talked during this time of davening. Now, you may think that I could, by any halacha, I could find something to scare you. It's not true. It's very rare editorializing in halachic works. Halachic works are very dry, monotonous. Anybody who went to law school, that's what they look like. For an editorial statement like that is very severe. So when you finish Mana Esrei, I don't advise it, but you could talk. When the shul starts saying Vayechulu, keep your mouth shut and focus on this really beautiful davening. It really is quite beautiful. I'll also point out that because Vayechulu and Magen Avos is really saying out loud, number one, you should try to finish Mana Esrei before the shul. It's not a time for a long Mana Esrei. But I'll tell you more. If you're in the middle of a L'kai Netzor, you should stop what you're doing and sing with the shul, especially Vayechulu. Once you say the first Yihilu Ratzon Imrei Fi V'Hegon Lib Lefanecha, once you said that, you could stop what you're doing when the shul sings, sing with them, and then go back to it. Okay, so I know a lot of this is male-oriented tonight. I promise we'll get off of this part of the Siddur. You know, Shachar's Musaf, that the women will relate to equally, so my apologies. Very quickly, before we end with Yigdal, and that's it, we're done, is Kiddush and Shul. For those who don't know, we make Kiddush and Shul Friday night. This is based on a Gemara, and it's certainly based on the guests who used to sleep in Shul. We don't have guests who sleep in Shul. But this is a reminder, like Hanukkah, that we light the Hanukkah candles in Shul, of the Parsumei Nisa, the celebration of the miracle of creation. Just like we light Hanukkah candles in Shul, even though that's not a fulfillment of a house, but what greater demonstration of the miracle, so too sanctifying the day in synagogue in front of Hamaynam, a large crowd, is a way of being a partner and testifying. I hate to use the word testifying, edus, because it's such a Christian term nowadays. Okay, and then we do Aleinu. Speaking of testifying, for those who came to the Siddur Share, we spent 3 weeks on Aleinu, but in 40 seconds or less, if you ever notice, the first chapter of Aleinu begins with an ayin and ends with a dalet. And the second chapter, Al Kain, starts with an ayin and ends with a dalet, echad. So that's aid, witness, 2 witnesses. That's what you need, 2 witnesses. According to the Torah, according to 2 witnesses, are things established. And in fact, this was written according to many. According to some, it was written by Jericho in the days of Yoshua. According to others, it was in fact a testimony against Jesus. It was written by Rava at the time of the Talmud, at the beginning of the sectarians and those early Christians. And for this reason, the Ashkenazim who lived among the Christians got rid of the phrase "Vehei mishtachim lahava v'rik." They bow down to nothingness. That was a reference to Jesus. We took that out, and for many centuries we didn't know it was there. When we moved to Amsterdam after the Spanish Inquisition, so you had, especially a little bit later in the Inquisition, in the 1700s, so you had Sfardim and Ashkenazim living together for the first time, and the Sfardim showed the Ashkenazim the Siddur. Sfardim lived among Muslims. So Muslims had no issue with saying V'hei mishtachim lahava v'rik. So we didn't know what to do. Should we add it back in? So Ashkenazim put it in brackets. So until this day, Art Scroll has it in brackets. But that's where it comes from. I always like to remind people that the Muslim theology, that they don't allow a picture of Muhammad, it's not because Muhammad is holy, quite the opposite. They don't allow drawings of Muhammad because there's only one God. And the fear is if you draw images of leaders, you may end up serving their leaders. So I've repeated this very often. So the Muslims would have no issue with saying that another religion, Christians, bow down to other gods. So they use the word testimony, Christians. We compose a lane to counter that. And then finally, for the end of this year, next week, we could finally talk about Shalom Aleichem. The next year on Shabbos, talk about Shalom Aleichem, Eishes Chayil, where that comes from. Eishes Chayil is an amazing history. And Kiddush, and the Kiddush cup, and what type of wine we're supposed to use, how much you're supposed to drink. Do you stand? Do you sit? What are those words in brackets? Are you supposed to say Vihi Erev, Vihi Boker? You're supposed to say Yom HaShishi. You're supposed to look at the candles. You have to give out the wine. If I'm listening to Kiddush, do I have to drink the wine? All these questions that we've had, thousands of little marbles of questions, we'll start next week. Knowing the rate we're going, it may take a couple of weeks, but I promise you, especially when we get back to Halacha, everything will be interesting. But I want to end with Yigdal, because Yigdal, at least in our shul and many other shuls, is the last thing you say Friday night. So I don't know if people have noticed this, but Yigdal is just like Ma'ayin Sheva, Ma'ayin Shalosh is an abridged version of benching or davening. Yigdal, does anybody know without looking what Yigdal is an encapsulation of, an abridged version of? Don't think about it. I don't want you to figure it out. Does anybody know offhand? What is Yigdal an abridged version of?
The 13.
That's exactly right.
You know it.
Points. The Ani Mammons, the 13 principles of faith.
God, how did you know that?
How did she know that? You should mute yourself when your husband questions you. So, but it's one of those things that once you hear it, you can never unhear it, because you start looking at Yigdal and you're like, yeah, let's open it up. So on page 12 in the art scroll, exalted be the living God and praise. He exists, unbounded by time. He is one is the next sentence. He has no body is the next sentence. He is preceded by no other being. Master, he created everything. He gave prophecy. There's no one like Moshe who will ever rise again. He gave people his Torah. He will never exchange his Torah. He knows our inner thoughts, reward and punishment. The end of days will bring Mashiach and revival of the dead. It's all there. So once you see that, you can never unsee it. Now, this is not like a trick. We don't know who the composer was, just like we don't know who the composer was of the Ani Mammons. You know, Ani Mammons is based on Maimonides. So let me give you some background here very quickly. We have 10 minutes, so we'll try to do it even less than 10. Maimonides wrote a commentary to Mishnayos when he was in his early 20s. In the introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, he talked about 13 yisodos, 13 foundations of faith. That's all the Rambam ever wrote about this, and they're very lengthy. Paragraph after paragraph explaining what is resurrection of the dead. What does it mean to believe, or to have a belief? What does God mean? What does Torah mean? Very verbose. It was only later that people encapsulated it in two ways. The Ani Mammons, I don't know who wrote it, but based on Maimonides, and Yigdal. So Yigdal and Ani Mammons are the popular Ma'ayin Yud Gimel, the abridged 13 principles of faith. Now, I give Art Scroll a lot of credit. So I want to give some background. Before I tell you the Art Scroll, let me whet your appetite for the next few minutes. Chabad refuses to say Yigdal. If you look at a Chabad Siddur, you will not find Yigdal in there, meaning Yigdal is controversial. Interesting. If ever a Chabad person come to shul and we sing Yigdal, you'll see they're not saying a word. So let's go a little bit deeper in Yigdal. So if you look for an example, and to Art Scroll's great credit, on page 178, they list after Shacharis the Ani Mammons. And they actually give a great, true historical background to the 13 principles. I'm going to read it to you. Historically, Judaism never separated belief from performance. In the Torah, the commandment to believe in God is not stated differently than the commandment to lend money to a fellow Jew in need or to refrain from eating non-kosher food. However, However, philosophical speculation and dogmas of faith became prevalent among other religions, and in time began to influence a number of Jews. To counteract this trend, medieval rabbinical authorities felt the need to define the principles of Judaism. So there's a lot more to say on this. I'll just tell you. So I'm in the midst of building a website now because Baruch Hashem, I have, I think, 1 million words written over the past 2 decades on so many topics. So I wanted to organize them, and also I don't remember what I wrote, and have a search engine and so on. And it's taking some time. So I was telling the guy who's doing it for me that we should put videos up, and the shul should, every time we have, not just me, anytime anybody speaks, we should video it. It should be searchable and so on. I only did it once before COVID, and it used to have 10,000 views, and now has 16,000 views. Do a search on YouTube, 13 Principles of Faith, Maimonides. You'll see a shir I gave at 16,000, not because it was a good shir. It's an hour shir. By the way, I'm stealing right now everything I gave in that shir from 15 years ago, but because the topic, people are very interested in this topic, I think, at least I am. So I was listening to my shir tonight from 15 years ago, and I go through, what the Art Scroll wrote, but more importantly, why do Chabad not say it? What's the problem with Yigdal? And really, what's the problem with the 13 Principles of Faith? Because that might be why they don't say Yigdal. So we all know Maimonides was controversial. Now, what I'm going to say now is going to shock you. The 13 Principles of Faith are controversial. It's not stated in the Talmud. There's no allusion to it in the Midrash, certainly not in Tanakh. Maimonides made it up. Now, when I say made it up, he made it up logically. So I want to explain 4 reasons, really 5, but 4 reasons why rabbis through the generations rejected the 13 principles of the Rambam. Reason number 1 is they did not accept the entire enterprise of principles. What do you mean principles? We are obligated to believe, the Talmud teaches us, in every letter of the Torah. If I get up and I say, I want to convert to Judaism, but I don't believe in Lashon Hara, could we convert them? No. Now, if someone says, I want to convert to Judaism, but I don't think I could beat the Yetzer Hara, we'll say, well, welcome to the rest of us. But if they say, I don't believe in it, in that one pasuk, that's an ikar, that's a fundamental. So what do you mean there are 13? There are 613 fundamentals. In fact, every letter of the Torah is a fundamental. The Arizal writes, and what's the Chabad Siddur called? Anybody know what the Chabad Siddur is called? Siddur? Someone unmute themselves. Come on, you know this. It's a Siddur Ha'ari. So the Arizal writes that you shouldn't say Yigdal. And he says it's because he didn't believe in the concept of Ikra. He took this stance. Now, this doesn't mean, don't get me wrong, if someone starts singing, Ani Mamin, oh, no, the Arizal didn't believe in that. Of course he believed in Mashiach and the one Torah and the one God, and Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy was greater because that's a pasuk in Chukas. And belief in God is a pasuk in Yisro. And what was the other one I said? Everything is mentioned, but not because they're separate. You have to remember, the Rambam says, have you ever wondered what's unique about Yigdal? What's unique about these 13 principles? The Rambam says whoever doesn't believe in these 13 loses everything that comes with membership. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha doesn't apply to you. Kashrus for a minion. I mean, you lose it. You're a Jew, but you're not a member. I think if I'm not mistaken, he uses the language, you're not a member of Klal Yisrael. Pretty strong language, okay? So the Arizal didn't like it because the entire Torah should fall into that category. Now, of course, today, people don't know better. They're raised in irreligious homes. Of course, we don't judge such people so harshly. I once shared a story, it could be here. William F. Buckley, I mention conservative people only because they write more. And I'm not mentioning this because Rosh Limbaugh died today. William F. Buckley, his best friend was a Jew. But William F. Buckley, when he died, his son, who's a great writer, who's more to the left, he wrote Thank You for Smoking. He wrote some very famous books. Someone could remember his name. No, someone remember his name? Buckley Jr. Something Buckley Jr. No one knows? Anyway, he wrote a book called something Loving Mom and Pop, because William F. Buckley and his mother were high society Manhattanites. They would have Broadway stars over, very not conservative of them, very hip liberal crowd they ran with. If you know William F. Buckley, you wouldn't be surprised. So in the book, he says a story how his dad, one of his best friends in the 60s and 70s, was a Jew. And he told his son, William F. Buckley told his son, he was very depressed. And the son said to him in the book, in the autobiography, he says, Dad, what's wrong? He says, you know, Jerry, I forgot the guy's name. Yeah, you know, he's my best friend. Yeah, I'm not going to see him after I die because he's damned to hell because he never accepted Jesus. Now, by the way, the story shows you that Buckley was a believing Christian. He really believed, and it hurt him. A few weeks later, he's in a jubilant mood, and his son says to him, Dad, what are you so happy about? And he said, I met with the priest. And there's a Latin concept, I forget what it's called, that when they're raised and they don't know better, then Jesus lets them into the kingdom. So I'll be able to meet him in the afterlife, even though he's a Jew. I don't know what the priest quoted, but the concept of Tinnik Shenishba predates Catholicism. So we have this concept that a person who was raised, they're not blamed for not knowing. Okay, so that's what?
You got a heter.
You got a heter.
Yeah.
Well, we all got a heter based on that priest. Okay, then there's another view why Yigdal is disapproved of, and really the whole Imam is disapproved of. That's that the Rambam got the wrong list. They have nothing, these Rishonim, these medieval scholars, I have nothing against making fundamentals of faith, but there's other things that should be on the list. Think about it. Is Shabbos on the list? Shabbos isn't on the 13 principles of faith. Is free will on the list? Not really. It's alluded to in reward and punishment. And Chassam Sofer discusses, what if someone believes in everything? He really believes in Torah Sinai. He learns Daf Yomi all day. He just doesn't believe that Mashiach will come. Chassam Sofer says it's not so simple to say he's not a believer. He's wrong, but to say that he transgressed the fundamental, these are very strong. Now again, I don't misquote me. All right, Tal say don't believe in Mashiach. No, we're talking about if you do believe in the concept of fundamentals. What we're asking is, if you take out this piece, the whole Jenga crumbles. So what are the 13 that you're not a Jew anymore? So that's the question. So, for example, there's a sefer by Rabbi Alba, very famous, called Sefer HaIkrim, the book of fundamentals. He says every faith is three things: a God, a revelation, and reward and punishment. Everything else is Judaism. But every faith has those Ikrim. So you see, so far we had two disputants: those who say everything's a fundamental, those that say the Rambam got it wrong, / these are always the three, everything else is commentary. I don't want to go too long. There are three other parts. You can listen to that shir that I gave on the 13 principles. You could see more opinions about this. But this is why some don't say Yigdal. Now, it's 2021. Even Chabad has songs based on Animamins. It seems that the Animamins have been accepted. So why would we still not say Yigdal? It doesn't seem like any of what I said applies anymore. So there's another reason why many don't say Yigdal. Again, we do. And that's because there are certain things that shouldn't be said to poetry, shouldn't be sent to song. If the Rambam is right that there are 13 principles, and these principles are so essential that if you miss one of them, you lose membership, maybe this shouldn't be something that we sing and clap to, and some poet that we don't even know made words to. What if he got one of the words wrong? Or he put a vav where it shouldn't be, and we're going to misinterpret what the fundamentals of law are. And some say that was the Arizal's concern. He agreed with the Maimonides in the 13 principles. Maybe not these, maybe others. He had no problem studying and believing in that view, but to sing it, especially a song composed by a poet that we don't even know their name, and base our religion on a poem for whose author we don't know, that far we shouldn't go. So what did we learn tonight? We learned a lot of things. Number one is you shouldn't talk when you finish Shemona Esrei Friday night, especially when we're saying Vayechulu and Magen Avos. We learned that the Chazan should bow by Magen Avos. We learned how latecomers should not be dismissed. We create halacha for them. We learned that Magen Avos is actually an encapsulation of the Shemona Esrei of Mariv. We learned why we do something special for Mariv Friday night, either because of the latecomers or because Mariv is more significant on Shabbos than any other Mariv. We learned about saying Kiddush and Shul. Even though the reason doesn't exist anymore, we learned about testimony and being a partner, because every day God creates the world. And that's a reminder for us in our own lives. And we learned about Aleinu, that's also a testimony, how it starts with Ayin Dalet twice, which is two witnesses. And of course, finally, we learned about something as simple as Yigdal is teeming with meaning. Baruch Hashem, for the next several weeks, we're not going to go back to the Siddur. We're going to get into more of halachas of Shabbos, the food, Kiddush, and the bread of Shabbos. Have a good night, everybody. Let me just announce for those who came late, speaking of latecomers, that we are aware that the website for the shul sign up for Purim was down. Please reset, as Betty said. Don't just try again. Reset the page, refresh the page, I should say, and it should work. And if it doesn't, call Moshe. Don't call me. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Good night, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good night, Rabbi. Thank you.
Bye-bye.